The fluorescent lights of Millbrook Veterinary Clinic buzzed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen prepared the final injection. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the cornfields, matching the somber mood inside the examination room. Old Blue, the German Shepherd mix, lay weakly on the metal table, his breathing labored and eyes cloudy with pain. Farmer Tom Harrison stood beside him, tears streaming down his weathered face as he whispered goodbye to his companion of 12 years. What should have been a routine euthanasia took an unexpected turn when Blue summoned his last bit of strength to wrap his paws around Tom's neck in a final embrace. That's when Sarah noticed it, a small metallic object embedded in the dog's collar, hidden beneath matted fur. As she examined it closer, her blood ran cold. The object was a key, and etched into its surface was a date from 20 years ago, the same date the town's beloved mare had mysteriously disappeared. Sarah had spent years trying to escape her past as a forensic investigator, but some secrets refused to stay buried. What had this dying dog been guarding all these years, and why was Tom Harrison suddenly looking at her with fear in his eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. "You need to put that back," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. The gentle farmer she'd known for 3 years had transformed into someone desperate and dangerous. "Tom, what is this?" Sarah kept her voice steady, drawing on years of training she'd hoped never to use again. "This key belonged to Mayor Matthews, didn't it?" Blue's breathing grew more ragged, his eyes fixed on Tom as if trying to communicate something urgent. The dog had been young when Matthews disappeared, maybe 2 years old. If he'd been protecting this key all these years, someone had put it there deliberately. "You don't understand," Tom said, releasing her wrist but blocking the door. "Some things are better left alone. Bobby Matthews was a good man, but he was asking too many questions, getting too close to things that should stay buried." Thunder rumbled outside, and the clinic's lights flickered momentarily. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she remembered from crime scenes. "What things, Tom? What was he investigating?" Sarah's mind catalogued the information automatically. She remembered the mysterious fire that had destroyed Millbrook Elementary in 2002 and the unusually generous federal aid package that had funded a state-of-the-art replacement. The new school had been Mayor Matthews' crowning achievement, completed just months before his disappearance. Who else knew about this? She asked, gently stroking Blue's head as his breathing became increasingly shallow. Half the town council was involved, the police chief, even the judge. They all had their hands in the till, but Bobby was the one with the conscience. Tom's voice cracked. "I found him that night, Sarah. Found him at the old quarry with a bullet in his head. They told me to keep quiet, said my family would be next if I talked." The pieces clicked into place. Tom had hidden the key with his young dog, the one place no one would think to look. For 20 years, Blue had carried the secret, and now he was taking it to his grave. "Where's the body, Tom?" "Bottom of the quarry. They weighted it down good." He glanced at Blue, whose breathing had become almost imperceptible. "I've been waiting for this day, you know. Dreading it. Blue was the only witness, the only proof I had left." Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of preparing the injection that would end Blue's suffering, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the state police." "You can't." Tom lunged forward, but Sarah was ready. Her forensic training kicked in, and she sidestepped his grab while keeping the phone out of reach. "Those people destroyed your friend and terrorized your family for 20 years, she said firmly. "Blue kept this secret safe, but he's telling us it's time for the truth." As if responding to her words, Blue's tail gave one weak wag. His eyes found Tom's face, and for a moment the fear left the farmer's expression. "Maybe you're right," Tom whispered. "Maybe it's time Bobby finally came home." Outside, lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the cornfields where a town's darkest secrets lay buried. The metallic taste of dread lingered in Sarah's mouth as she drove through Millbrook's empty streets at dawn. The town looked different now, its familiar facades hiding secrets she'd never imagined. Every weathered storefront, every carefully tended garden seemed to mock her with their innocent appearances. She'd barely slept after finding the photograph tucked inside the old dog collar. The image burned in her memory. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, standing beside what looked like the old mill on the outskirts of town. On the back, someone had written Emma, 1987, in fading blue ink. Sarah had never heard of an Emma who'd gone missing. But then again, she'd only moved to Millbrook 5 years ago to take over Dr. Patterson's practice. What did she really know about this place beyond its current residents and their beloved pets? The veterinary clinic felt hollow as she unlocked the door. Usually the familiar scent of antiseptic and the soft whimpers of recovering animals brought her comfort. Today, everything seemed charged with menace. She went straight to her office and spread the contents of the metal box across her desk under the harsh fluorescent light. Besides the photograph, there were 3 more items: a child's plastic bracelet with Emma spelled out in pink letter beads, a yellowed newspaper clipping, and a folded piece of paper covered in cramped handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the newspaper clipping. The headline made her stomach drop: "Search continues for missing girl." The article was brief, dated September 15, 1987. 8-year-old Emma Hartley had disappeared while walking home from school. Despite extensive searches, no trace had been found. The article mentioned her distraught parents, Robert and Margaret Hartley, and included the same photograph Sarah had found in the box. The handwritten note was harder to decipher. The ink had faded and the paper was brittle, but she could make out fragments. "Can't live with what we did. Buried her where no one would look. God forgive us. If anything happens to me, Emma deserves justice." Sarah's coffee grew cold as she stared at the evidence. Someone had killed Emma Hartley and hidden her body. Someone had also documented their guilt, keeping these items as either insurance or confession. The question was, who? The bell above the clinic door chimed, making her jump. She quickly gathered the items and shoved them into her desk drawer just as Margaret Chen, the town librarian, entered carrying her ancient tabby cat. "Good morning, Dr. Winters," Margaret said, her voice tight with worry. "Mr. Whiskers hasn't been eating again." Sarah forced herself to focus on the examination, but her mind kept drifting. After Margaret left with antibiotics and feeding instructions, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts again. She needed to know more about Emma Hartley, but she couldn't exactly start asking around town without raising suspicions. The library. Margaret would have access to old newspaper archives, missing person reports, anything that might shed light on what happened 36 years ago. Sarah closed the clinic early, claiming a family emergency to her assistant. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its reading rooms quiet and dimly lit. Margaret looked surprised to see her back so soon. "Doing some research," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'm thinking about writing a history of the town for the Veterinary Association newsletter. You know, local color for the pet owners." Margaret's face lit up. "What a wonderful idea. The historical archives are in the basement. I'll show you where everything is." The basement smelled of old paper and mothballs. Rows of filing cabinets contained decades of the Millbrook Gazette, town records, and local memorabilia. Margaret left her with a promise to check on her in an hour. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out the files from 1987. The coverage of Emma's disappearance was more extensive than the single clipping suggested. For weeks, the front page had been dominated by search efforts, interviews with neighbors, and desperate pleas from her parents. Robert Hartley had been a construction foreman. Margaret Hartley worked part-time at the town clerk's office. They'd lived on Elm Street in a small blue house. The police had questioned a drifter who'd been seen in town, but he had an alibi. There were no suspects, no leads, no resolution. Then, abruptly, the coverage stopped. The final article, dated October 30th, 1987, was brief, Parents of missing girl leave town. Robert and Margaret Hartley had sold their house and moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Sarah sat back in the uncomfortable metal chair, her mind racing. The Hartleys were long gone, probably dead after all these years, but someone in Millbrook knew what had happened to their daughter, someone who was still here, still living among the very people who'd spent weeks searching for a child they might have killed. The question was no longer what had happened to Emma Hartley. The question was, what was Sarah going to do about it? The drive to the Whitmore property felt longer than usual, every familiar landmark blurring past as Sarah's mind raced. The small piece of metal sat heavy in her jacket pocket, its jagged edges catching on the fabric each time she shifted. She'd barely slept, turning the discovery over in her mind until dawn crept through her bedroom curtains. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 50 acres on the outskirts of town, its Victorian mansion standing like a monument to old money and older secrets. Henry Whitmore had built his fortune in timber during the 1940s, establishing himself as one of Millbrook's founding fathers. Now his son Charles maintained the family's prominence through real estate development and generous donations to every civic cause that mattered. Sarah pulled into the circular driveway, gravel crunching under her tires. She'd called ahead, explaining she needed to discuss something about Rusty's condition. Charles had sounded puzzled, but agreed to meet her. The front door opened before she could knock. Charles Whitmore stood framed in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 65, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to respect and deference. But today, something in his pale blue eyes seemed guarded. "Dr. Chen, please come in. I hope you have good news about Rusty's recovery prospects." Sarah followed him into a study lined with leather-bound books and family photographs. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood. Charles gestured to a chair across from his mahogany desk, settling himself behind it like a judge preparing to hear testimony. "I'm afraid Rusty didn't make it through the night," Sarah began, watching Charles's face carefully. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could." Charles's expression shifted to what appeared genuine grief. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "He was a good dog, loyal. My father would have been heartbroken. Mr. Whitmore, during our examination, we found something unusual." Sarah reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the metal fragment. This was embedded deep in his leg tissue. "It looks like it's been there for many years." She placed the piece on the desk between them. Charles leaned forward, his face a mask of polite curiosity that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not sure I understand the significance, Doctor. The metal appears to be from a vehicle. Given the depth of penetration and tissue scarring, I'd estimate it's been there for decades." Sarah paused, studying his reaction. "Possibly from the 1970s. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Charles picked up the fragment, turning it over in his manicured fingers. When he looked up, his expression had hardened almost imperceptibly. "And you think this is somehow important because a hit-and-run accident isn't just a veterinary matter, Mr. Whitmore, especially one that might be connected to an unsolved case." Charles set the metal down with deliberate care. "Dr. Chen, I think you may be letting your imagination run away with you. Dogs get into all sorts of accidents. They chase cars, run into farm equipment. This could be from anything." But Sarah had noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened when she mentioned the 1970s. She thought of the newspaper clipping she'd found online that morning, a brief article about a young woman named Rebecca Martinez who'd disappeared after leaving a party in June 1973. Her car had been found abandoned on Highway 9, but Rebecca had never been located. The case had gone cold within months. "You're probably right," Sarah said, reaching for the fragment. "I suppose I should turn it over to the police anyway. Let them determine if it's worth investigating." Charles's hand shot out, covering the metal piece. "Now, let's not be hasty. Think about what you're suggesting here. If word gets out that you're trying to connect my family's dog to some ancient police matter, it could cause unnecessary gossip. You know how this town talks." There it was, the subtle threat wrapped in reasonable concern. Sarah had heard that tone before from powerful men who weren't accustomed to being questioned. "I'm not suggesting anything about your family, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply saying that if this metal came from a vehicle involved in a crime, the police should know about it." Charles stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked his pristine gardens. "Dr. Chen, you've been in Millbrook for what, 3 years now? You've built a good practice, earned people's trust. It would be unfortunate if unfounded speculation damaged your reputation." The threat was clearer now, barely veiled behind his cultivated politeness. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you suggesting I shouldn't do my civic duty?" Charles turned back to her, his smile cold as winter moonlight. "I'm suggesting you think very carefully about the consequences of stirring up old ghosts. Some things are better left buried, Doctor, for everyone's sake." The morning air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Sarah drove the winding road toward the Henderson farm. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the black leather. The metal object from yesterday's discovery sat heavy in her jacket pocket, wrapped in a clean surgical cloth. She'd barely slept, turning the implications over in her mind like a tumor she couldn't excise. Marcus Henderson's property sprawled across 60 acres of rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle. The farmhouse, painted white with green shutters, had stood for over a century according to local law. As Sarah pulled into the gravel driveway, she noticed Marcus emerge from the barn, his weathered face creasing into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Doc Sterling, good to see you, though I wasn't expecting a house call today." His voice carried the careful politeness of someone who sensed trouble approaching. Sarah stepped out of her truck, forcing herself to appear casual. "I wanted to check on how you're handling things with Rex. Losing a companion after so many years can be difficult." Marcus nodded, removing his worn baseball cap to run fingers through grey hair. "Appreciate that. Rex was a good dog, loyal to the end." He paused, studying her face. "Though something tells me that's not the only reason you're here." The directness caught Sarah off guard. She'd planned to ease into the conversation, but Marcus Henderson had always been perceptive. "You're right. I found something yesterday during Rex's examination. Something that's been troubling me." "Found something?" His tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. Sarah reached into her pocket, feeling the weight of the metal fragment, a piece of jewelry. It looked like it had been in Rex's stomach for a long time. "I was hoping you might recognize it." She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the tarnished silver. Marcus's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face drained of color, and he took an involuntary step backward. For a moment, the only sound was the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the trees. "Where did you say you found this?" His voice had become carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the tremor underneath. "In Rex's stomach during the necropsy. Based on the corrosion and the way his stomach lining had adapted, I'd estimate it had been there for decades, probably since he was a puppy." Marcus stared at the jewelry without touching it, his jaw working silently. Sarah watched his face, noting the way his eyes darted toward the old oak tree near the property line, then back to her. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it was enough. "I don't recognize it," he said finally, but the words sounded rehearsed. "Could be anything. You know how dogs are, especially as puppies. They'll eat anything that catches their interest." Sarah carefully rewrapped the jewelry, her movements deliberate. "The thing is, Marcus, this isn't just any piece of jewelry. It's a charm bracelet. Very distinctive style, probably from the 1970s or early 80s, the kind of thing a young woman might wear." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze now fixed firmly on the ground. When he looked up, Sarah saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before: fear. "A lot of people have passed through this area over the years," he said. "Hikers, hunters, travelers. Could have been dropped anywhere, picked up by Rex during one of his wanderings." "That's possible," Sarah agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But Rex was always well-trained, wasn't he?" Stayed close to home unless you were with him? Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. What exactly are you suggesting, Doc? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, understanding that her next words would determine the course of everything that followed. She thought about the young woman who had once worn this bracelet, about the secrets that small towns bury, about the price of truth in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said carefully. "I'm simply trying to understand how a piece of jewelry ended up inside your dog for most of his life. If there's nothing to explain, then there's nothing to worry about." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his weathered features revealing nothing. Finally, he nodded toward the house. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. We could sit on the porch, talk about Rex's better days." Sarah recognized the deflection but also sensed an opportunity. "That sounds nice." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Dr. Sarah Chen sat in her truck outside the Millbrook Public Library. Inside were photocopies of everything she'd found in the hidden compartment, photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a child's drawing of stick figures beneath a large tree, the same oak tree where she'd buried Max just 2 days ago. She'd barely slept since making the discovery. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the terrified face of the little girl in the photographs, heard Max's labored breathing as he'd led her to his final secret. The dog had known. Somehow he had known what was buried there long before she'd dug his grave. "Dr. Chen, what brings you here on such a dreary afternoon?" Margaret's voice carried the warmth of someone genuinely pleased by unexpected company. The older woman looked up from a stack of old newspapers she was cataloguing, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Sarah's mouth felt dry. "I'm doing some research on local history. Specifically, I'm wondering if you remember anything unusual happening in town during the late 1960s or early 1970s. Missing persons, perhaps?" Margaret's expression shifted subtly, a cloud passing over her features. "That's quite specific. Any particular reason?" "I found some old items while doing yard work. Thought they might have historical significance." The lie came easier than Sarah expected, but the guilt that followed was immediate and sharp. "I see." Margaret set down her papers and folded her hands. "The late 60s were turbulent times everywhere, Dr. Chen. Even in small towns like ours, there were incidents that perhaps weren't handled as they should have been." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of incidents?" "There was a family, the Hartmans, who lived on the outskirts of town. Strange folk, kept to themselves mostly. Had a little girl, Emma. Sweet thing, but always seemed frightened. One day in 1971, they just up and disappeared. House abandoned, belongings left behind. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma. She thought of the terrified child in the photographs, and her stomach churned. Did anyone investigate their disappearance? Margaret's laugh held no humor. Investigate? Sheriff Brennan, that would be our current sheriff's father, he said they'd probably just moved on. Folks like that, he said, they never stayed anywhere long. But some of us wondered. Wondered what? The girl had been seen with bruises. More than once. And there were stories about what went on in that house after dark. Stories that would make your blood run cold. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Some people said the father wasn't right in the head. Others whispered about visitors who came in the night, important men from town who had no business being there. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. Important men? The kind of men who could make problems disappear, if you catch my meaning. Men with money, influence, the kind who thought they were untouchable. Margaret studied Sarah's face carefully. "What exactly did you find, Dr. Chen?" Before Sarah could answer, the library's front door chimed, and heavy footsteps echoed down the basement stairs. Sheriff Tom Brennan appeared, his bulk filling the narrow stairway. His usual friendly demeanor was notably absent. "Afternoon, ladies. Margaret, my deputy said he saw Dr. Chen's truck outside. Thought I'd stop by and see how our newest resident is settling in." The timing felt far too convenient to be coincidental. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, but her hand instinctively moved to the envelope beside her. "Just doing a little historical research," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "History, huh? What kind of history?" His eyes were hard, searching. Margaret intervened smoothly. "Dr. Chen was asking about the old families in the area. I was just telling her about the Hartmans and how they left town so suddenly." Something dangerous flashed across Brennan's face. The Hartmans. Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. My father used to tell stories about that family. Said they were trouble from the day they arrived until the day they left. "Left?" Sarah asked. "I thought they disappeared." "Same thing, really. Point is, they're long gone, and good riddance." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some stones are better left unturned, Dr. Chen. Small towns have long memories, but sometimes forgetting is healthier for everyone involved." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt the weight of the envelope pressing against her side like a loaded gun. Whatever had happened to Emma Hartman, whatever secrets those photographs contained, people in positions of power clearly wanted them to stay buried. As buried as the little girl who might still be lying beneath the old oak tree. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah clutched it against her chest, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Mrs. Henderson could hear it through the clinic's thin walls. The photographs inside seemed to burn through the paper, their implications spreading like poison through her thoughts. The bell above the front door chimed, startling her from her spiral of paranoia. Tom Chen stepped inside, his usual easy smile faltering when he saw her expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, approaching her desk with concern etched across his features. "Everything all right?" Sarah's mouth went dry. Tom had been her closest friend since veterinary school, the one person in Millbrook she'd trusted completely. But now, staring at his familiar face, she found herself wondering what else she might have been wrong about. "I'm fine," she managed, sliding the envelope beneath a stack of patient files. "Just tired." Tom's eyes tracked the movement, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Must be all that extra work you've been taking on. Heard you were out at the Hartley place yesterday." The casual comment hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't mentioned the Hartley visit to anyone except Detective Mills. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee mug, buying time to process this revelation. "News travels fast in a small town," she said carefully. "Especially when it involves the old Hartley property." Tom leaned against her desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "That place has quite a history, you know. Probably better left undisturbed." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt the walls of the clinic closing in around her, the familiar space suddenly feeling foreign and threatening. How many conversations like this had she missed over the years? How many seemingly innocent remarks had actually been carefully placed warnings? "I should get back to work," she said, standing abruptly. "Mrs. Peterson's cat needs its vaccinations." Tom straightened, his hand briefly touching her arm. "Sarah, be careful. This town, it protects its own, but sometimes that protection comes at a cost." After he left, Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. The envelope seemed to pulse beneath the files, its contents demanding action while everyone around her counseled caution or issued veiled threats. She waited until the clinic grew quiet, then retrieved the photographs with shaking hands. The images were even more disturbing in the harsh fluorescent light, the shallow grave, the small bones, the remnants of clothing that spoke of a child's final moments. But it was the last photograph that made her stomach lurch. A class picture from Millbrook Elementary, circa 1993, with one face circled in red ink. Jenny Morrison, 7 years old when she'd supposedly moved away with her family after her father lost his job at the mill. Sarah remembered the story now, how it had been whispered about for months before gradually fading into the town's collective amnesia. But Jenny Morrison hadn't moved away. Jenny Morrison was buried in an unmarked grave on the Hartley property, and someone wanted Sarah to know about it. The question was, why? And more importantly, who? A soft knock at the back door made her jump. She quickly stuffed the photographs back into the envelope, her paranoia spiking as she approached the entrance. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a slight figure silhouetted against the parking lot security light. "Dr. Chen?" The voice was elderly, tremulous. "It's Eleanor Hartley." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Eleanor Hartley, the woman whose property held such terrible secrets, whose family name was somehow connected to decades-old tragedy. With trembling fingers, Sarah unlocked the door. The woman standing on her doorstep bore little resemblance to the powerful Hartley matriarch Sarah had imagined. Eleanor was tiny and frail, her white hair escaping from a hastily tied scarf, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I know what you found," Eleanor whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "And I know what they'll do to keep it buried. You're in terrible danger, Dr. Chen. I don't understand." "The dog," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Zeus didn't just wander onto my property. He was led there. Someone wanted those bones found, wanted the truth to finally come out. But there are people in this town who will kill to keep their secrets safe." Sarah stepped back, her world tilting on its axis. "Who? Who would—" "The same people who killed Jenny Morrison 30 years ago," Eleanor said, her weathered face crumpling with grief. "The same people who've been watching you since the moment you found her body." In the distance, the sound of approaching engines cut through the night air, growing steadily louder. The morning light filtering through Dr. Sarah Chen's kitchen window felt different somehow, as if the world had shifted overnight. She sat at her small table, staring at the evidence spread before her, the faded photograph, the handwritten note, and the small metal object that had been hidden in Rusty's collar for who knows how long. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The photograph showed 5 young men in military uniforms, their faces bright with the invincibility of youth. She recognized Mayor Harrison immediately, his distinctive jawline unchanged despite the decades. But it was the man standing next to him that made her hands tremble. The face was unmistakably that of Thomas Brennan, the missing soldier whose disappearance had haunted Millbrook for 30 years. The handwritten note, yellowed with age, was brief but chilling. "If something happens to me, look for the truth where the old mill meets the creek. TB." Sarah's phone buzzed, startling her from her thoughts. Detective Morgan's name appeared on the screen. "Dr. Chen, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. There's something you should know about the Brennan case." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" "I did some digging through the old files. The night Thomas Brennan disappeared, there was an incident at Murphy's bar. A fight broke out between several local men and some soldiers on leave. The police report mentions Harrison was there, along with a few others who are still prominent in town." Sarah glanced at the photograph again. "Detective, I think we need to meet. There's something I need to show you." "Can't talk over the phone?" "Not about this." They arranged to meet at the clinic in an hour. Sarah carefully gathered the items, placing them in a manila envelope. As she prepared to leave, her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on the door. "Sarah, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by so early." The elderly woman's face was creased with worry. "I heard through the grapevine that you've been asking questions about the Brennan boy." Sarah's stomach tightened. News traveled fast in Millbrook. "Mrs. Patterson, did you know Thomas?" "Oh, honey, everyone knew Tommy. Sweet boy, always helping folks around town." She paused, glancing around nervously. "But there are some things that are better left buried, if you catch my meaning." "What kind of things?" Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Tommy wasn't the only one who went missing over the years. There was that drifter in '98, and before that, old Pete Morrison, who used to live up on Cedar Ridge. Folks said they just moved on, but—" She shook her head. "This town has its secrets, Sarah, dark ones." After Mrs. Patterson left, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She drove to the clinic with her rearview mirror constantly in check, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Detective Morgan was already waiting in the parking lot when she arrived. His unmarked car looked out of place among the usual collection of pickup trucks and family sedans. Sarah led him inside, locking the door behind them. "What you're about to see changes everything," she said, spreading the contents of the envelope on her examination table. Morgan studied each item carefully, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When he picked up the metal object, a military dog tag bearing Thomas Brennan's name and service number, he let out a low whistle. "Where exactly did you find these?" "Hidden in the collar of a dog that died in my care. The dog belonged to the Henderson family, but before that, it lived with old Jimmy Morrison up on Cedar Ridge." "Morrison," Morgan repeated, making notes. "Any relation to the Pete Morrison your neighbor mentioned?" "Jimmy's his brother. And here's the thing, Jimmy's been acting strange lately, nervous, like he's afraid of something." Morgan pocketed the dog tag and photograph. "I'm going to need to keep these as evidence, and Dr. Chen, I need you to be very careful. If what we're looking at here is what I think it is, then we're dealing with something that goes much deeper than one missing person." "You think there are others?" "I think there's a reason the dog ended up with items that should have been buried with Thomas Brennan 30 years ago." He paused at the door. "Don't discuss this with anyone else. And if you notice anything unusual, anyone following you, strange phone calls, anything, you call me immediately." The weight of Rusty's final gift pressed down on her shoulders. That dying dog had entrusted her with a truth that someone had killed to keep hidden. The question now was whether she had the courage to see it through to the end. The morning air carried the scent of rain as Sarah drove through the empty streets toward the clinic. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, the weight of what she'd discovered pressing down like a physical force. The photograph tucked in her jacket pocket seemed to burn against her chest, proof that Margaret Whitmore, the town's beloved former mayor, had been present at the construction site where those children had died 30 years ago. She'd barely slept, her mind racing through the implications. Margaret had been a city council member then, involved in approving the construction permits for the playground. If she knew about the faulty foundation, about the corners that were cut, why hadn't she spoken up? Why had she let those families suffer in silence all these years? The clinic parking lot was deserted except for Detective Mills's unmarked sedan. Sarah's pulse quickened as she spotted him waiting by the front door, his expression grim in the grey morning light. "Dr. Chen," he said as she approached. "We need to talk." She unlocked the door with shaking fingers. "I've found something you need to see." Inside, Mills followed her to the office, where she'd spent the night piecing together fragments of the past. The photograph lay on her desk alongside newspaper clippings and construction documents she'd managed to dig up from the town's online archives. "Before you show me anything," Mills said, "I need to tell you something. We ran the DNA from the dog's collar against missing persons reports from the 80s and 90s. Sarah's breath caught. "And?" "We got a match. Timothy Walsh, age 8, disappeared in 1994, 3 months after the playground collapse." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk. "That's impossible. The playground collapse was in 1993. All the victims were accounted for." "That's what I thought too." Mills pulled out a file folder. "But Timothy wasn't a victim of the collapse. He disappeared from his home 3 months later. His parents, David and Linda Walsh, reported him missing, but the case went cold. No leads, no witnesses, no trace." Sarah stared at the photograph Mills placed before her, a school picture of a gap-toothed boy with sandy hair and freckles, the same boy whose collar Bella had been wearing, whose DNA had somehow survived 3 decades buried in the woods. "The Walsh family lived 2 blocks from the playground," Mills continued. "David Walsh was one of the construction workers who built it." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Sarah reached for the photograph she'd found in Margaret's papers. "Look at this." Mills studied the image. Margaret Whitmore standing with several men in hard hats at what was clearly the playground construction site. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was David Walsh. "Margaret knew," Sarah whispered. "She knew about the faulty construction, and David Walsh was there. He would have known too." "You think Walsh killed his own son to keep him quiet?" Sarah shook her head. "No, not his father. Think about it. Timothy disappeared 3 months after the collapse, long enough for the guilt to eat away at David, long enough for him to maybe confess to his family what really happened. What if Timothy overheard something? What if he threatened to tell? Mills was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. You're suggesting someone killed an 8-year-old boy to cover up their involvement in the playground deaths. Before Mills could respond, the clinic's front door chimed. Sarah's blood turned to ice as familiar footsteps echoed down the hallway. Margaret Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her usual warm smile faltering as she took in the scene. The photographs, the documents, the detective's badge gleaming on his belt. "Sarah, dear," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Mills stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Mrs. Whitmore, actually, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing the Walsh family." Margaret's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. "The Walshes? Such a tragedy, what happened to their boy. David never got over it, you know. Blamed himself somehow for Timothy's disappearance. Did he?" Sarah found her voice. "Or did he blame someone else?" The older woman's eyes darted between Sarah and Mills, calculating. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Sarah saw something cold and desperate underneath the grandmotherly facade. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Margaret said carefully. Mills held up the photograph. "We're implying that you knew about the construction defects that led to those children's deaths, and we're wondering if Timothy Walsh knew it too." Margaret stared at the image for a long moment, her shoulders sagging as if a great weight had finally become too much to bear. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but whether they were tears of guilt or grief, Sarah couldn't tell. "You have no idea," Margaret whispered, "what you're about to unleash." The envelope trembled in Sarah's hands as she sat in her truck outside the Riverside County Records office. 3 hours of digging through property deeds, construction permits, and municipal records had painted a picture she wished she could unsee. The Henderson family hadn't just owned the land where she'd found the collar. They'd controlled half the town's development for the past 40 years. Her phone buzzed. Another missed call from Chief Morrison. She'd been avoiding him since yesterday, knowing that once she shared what she'd discovered, there would be no turning back. The weight of knowledge pressed against her chest like a physical force. Sarah's veterinary training had taught her to read signs others missed, to piece together symptoms that told a larger story. The pattern emerging from these dusty files felt sickeningly familiar. The methodical covering of tracks, the systematic burial of evidence. She pulled out the photocopy of a building permit dated September 15, 1983. Robert Henderson's bold signature sprawled across the bottom, authorizing emergency concrete work at the library site. The timing made her stomach clench. Tommy had vanished on September 12th. A tap on her passenger window made her jump. Frank Morrison stood beside her truck, his weathered face etched with concern. She reluctantly rolled down the window. "Avoiding my calls isn't going to make this go away, Sarah." "I know." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mind if I get in? We need to talk." She unlocked the door, and Frank settled his bulk into the passenger seat with a heavy sigh. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching afternoon shadows stretch across the parking lot. 27 years, I've been chief of police in this town, Frank said finally. I've seen accidents, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in, but this, he gestured toward the records office, this is something else entirely. Sarah handed him the photocopied permit. She watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment understanding dawned. His jaw tightened. Jesus Christ. The library dedication was October 1st. I remember because my daughter gave a speech at the ceremony. He looked up at her. You think Tommy's under there? I think it's possible. The timing, the location, the fact that this project required emergency concrete work just 3 days after he disappeared. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. And there's more. She pulled out a manila folder containing her research on other missing children from neighboring counties. 3 cases over 15 years, all unsolved, all in areas where Henderson Construction had major projects during the same time periods. Frank studied the documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent decades reading police reports. This is circumstantial at best, pattern matching. But it's enough for reasonable suspicion, isn't it? Enough to justify ground-penetrating radar. The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Frank rubbed his temples, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. Do you understand what you're asking? The library is the heart of this community. It's where kids learn to read, where the seniors have their book clubs, where the town council meets. If we're wrong about this, and if we're right, Frank's silence was answer enough. There's something else, she said quietly. I did some research on Robert Henderson. He had a juvenile record that was sealed, but I have a contact at social services. 3 incidents of animal cruelty before he turned 18. Frank's head snapped up. Animal cruelty? Killing neighborhood cats. There's a documented pattern in criminal psychology. I know the pattern. Frank's voice was grim. Animals first, then escalation. The weight of unspoken implications settled over them. Sarah thought of Rusty's final journey, how the old dog had somehow known where to lead her. Had he been trying to right an ancient wrong, or simply following some instinct that recognized the presence of death? What do we do now? She asked. Frank stared at the library in the distance, its cheerful red bricks warm in the afternoon sun. We do our job, even if it destroys everything people in this town believe about themselves. He reached for the door handle, then paused. Sarah, once we start down this road, there's no going back. You sure you're ready for that? She thought of Tommy Brennan's parents, who'd spent 40 years wondering what happened to their son. She thought of other families, who might finally have answers. I'm ready. The fluorescent lights in the veterinary clinic hummed overhead as Sarah stared at the X-ray film clipped to the lightbox. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the outline of what shouldn't have been there, a small metallic object lodged near the old dog's ribcage. Max had passed peacefully 3 days ago, but not before leading her to this moment that would change everything. She'd almost missed it during the routine examination she'd promised the Henderson family, almost dismissed the slight irregularity as calcification or an old injury. But something had nagged at her, the same instinct that had drawn her to follow Max into the woods that terrible night when he'd shown her the shallow grave. Working late again? Sarah spun around to find Deputy Collins standing in the doorway, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't heard the bell above the front door. Her pulse quickened. Just finishing up some paperwork, she managed, stepping sideways to block his view of the X-ray. What brings you by, Deputy? Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Call me Frank. We've been neighbors long enough. He moved closer, his boots clicking against the linoleum. I heard you've been asking questions around town, about the old mining incident. Just curious about local history. Sarah's mouth felt dry. She glanced toward the back exit, calculating the distance. You know how it is in small towns. Stories get passed down. They do indeed. Frank's hand rested casually on his service weapon. Sometimes those stories are better left alone, though. Sometimes digging into the past just brings pain to people who've moved on. The X-ray film crinkled softly in the breeze from the air conditioning vent. Sarah fought the urge to look at it, knowing Frank would follow her gaze. Instead, she focused on his face, searching for any trace of the man who used to bring his injured animals to her clinic, who'd seemed genuinely concerned about the community's welfare. I found something, Frank. The words slipped out before she could stop them. His expression didn't change, but she saw the slight tightening around his eyes. Did you now? In Max, the dog that died. There's something inside him that doesn't belong. She took a half step toward the X-ray, watching his reaction. Something that might explain what really happened to those missing miners 30 years ago. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the lightbox. When he looked back at her, the pretense of friendliness had vanished. You should have minded your own business, Sarah. 5 men, Frank. 5 men with families who never knew what happened to them. Her voice gained strength despite her fear. Max found where they were buried. And now I know one of them was shot. You don't know anything. Frank moved to the light box, studying the X-ray with professional interest. You have a fragment of metal in a dead dog. Could be anything. Old fishing lure, piece of farming equipment. We both know it isn't. Frank sighed deeply, suddenly looking older than his 50-something years. Those miners weren't supposed to be in that section of the mountain. It was dangerous, unstable. We warned them. So you killed them? We tried to stop them. They'd found something down there, something that would have ruined this entire town if word got out. The mining company was going to pull out, take every job with them. His voice took on a pleading quality. Do you understand what that would have meant? This place would have died. Sarah felt sick. What did they find? Evidence of previous cave-ins. Proof that the company knew the whole operation was unsafe but kept sending men down anyway. Those 5 miners were going to the newspapers, going to shut everything down. Frank shook his head. Mayor Patterson, Sheriff Williams, even Doc Morrison, we all agreed it was for the greater good. So you buried them and covered it up. We saved this town. Every family that stayed, every child who grew up here instead of in some urban wasteland, that was because of what we did. Frank's hand tightened on his weapon. And I'll be damned if I let one dog and one veterinarian undo 30 years of protecting this community. Sarah's mind raced. The back door was 15 feet away, but Frank was between her and the front exit. Her cell phone sat on the counter, just out of reach. Doc Morrison knew? The betrayal hit her harder than the fear. The man who'd mentored her, who'd trusted her with his life's work. The X-ray film fluttered again, and Sarah realized she was about to become another secret, buried in the name of protecting Millbrook's peace. The fluorescent lights of the clinic hummed overhead as Sarah stared at the photographs spread across her desk. Each image told a piece of the story she was desperately trying to understand. The skeletal remains from beneath the Hendersons' property, the corroded metal tag that had led her down this rabbit hole, and now the birth certificate she'd managed to obtain from the county records office. Her hands trembled as she held the document dated 37 years ago. Baby boy Henderson, stillborn. But the dog tag belonged to someone very much alive, or at least someone who had been alive long enough to serve in Vietnam and return home to Millbrook. The clinic door chimed, startling her from her thoughts. She quickly shuffled the papers into a folder as Tom Bradley walked in, his police uniform wrinkled and his face bearing the weight of sleepless nights. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. Sarah's pulse quickened. "About what? About what you found? About what you think you know?" Tom closed the door behind him and flipped the sign to closed. "People are starting to ask questions, Sarah, the kind of questions that stir up trouble." She stood slowly, the folder clutched against her chest. "What kind of people?" "Harold Henderson came to see me this morning. Said you'd been asking around about his family, digging into old records." Tom's eyes were hard, but she could see something else beneath the surface. Fear. "He's not happy about it." "I bet he's not." Sarah moved around the desk, keeping distance between them. "Especially if he knows what's really buried under his property." Tom's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're dealing with here." "Then tell me." She set the folder on the counter behind her, her fingers still resting on it protectively. "Tell me about David Kowalski. Tell me why his dog tag was buried with those bones. Tell me why a baby who was supposed to be stillborn 37 years ago might actually be walking around this town today." The color drained from Tom's face. For a moment he looked like he might collapse, but then he straightened, his cop instincts taking over. "Some secrets are buried for good reasons, Sarah. Not this one." Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This one needs to see daylight. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're not." Tom stepped closer, and Sarah noticed his hand resting near his service weapon. "There are people in this town who've spent decades building their lives on the foundation of that secret. Good people, people with families, reputations, futures. What about David Kowalski's family? What about his future?" Sarah's voice rose. He came back from a war, and instead of getting the life he deserved, he ended up dead and buried in someone else's grave while their baby took his identity. Tom's silence spoke volumes. "I was barely out of high school when it happened," Tom said quietly. "My father was sheriff then. He told me years later, made me promise to keep it buried." His voice cracked. "David Kowalski came back from Vietnam broken, addicted, angry. He was causing problems for people, making threats. When the Henderson baby was stillborn, someone saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once." "Someone?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Who? It doesn't matter now. They're all dead except—" Tom caught himself, but it was too late. "Except who?" When he didn't answer, Sarah's mind raced through the connections. Harold Henderson would have been too young. But his father— She paused, pieces clicking into place. "Dr. Morrison. He delivered the baby, signed the death certificate. He would have had access, opportunity." Tom's expression confirmed her suspicions. "And the child who took David's identity, where is he now?" But even as she asked, Sarah realized she already knew. The timing, the age, the way certain people in town seemed untouchable despite their obvious flaws. "Don't," Tom warned, seeing the recognition in her eyes. "Mayor Davidson." The name fell from her lips like a stone. "Robert Davidson is David Kowalski." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decades-old lies and the destruction that truth could bring. Tom's radio crackled to life, dispatcher calling about a minor traffic accident, but he ignored it. "Now you understand," he said finally. "This isn't just about one dead man anymore. It's about families, careers, an entire community built around people who trusted their leaders. Bob Davidson has been a good mayor, a good husband and father. He doesn't even know the truth about his own identity." Sarah stared at him, horrified. "He doesn't know." The Hendersons never told him. As far as he knows, he's their biological son who survived a difficult birth. The truth died with his adoptive parents. Tom's shoulders sagged. Until now. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Millbrook, casting shadows that seemed to creep closer to the clinic windows. Sarah realized that some truths once uncovered could never be buried again. Her phone buzzed insistently on the metal examination table. Sheriff Reynolds' name flashed across the screen for the third time in 20 minutes. Sarah let it go to voicemail again. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone, not until she understood what she'd stumbled into. The archived headlines blurred together: "Local girl missing, search continues for Emma Patterson, family offers reward." Emma's school photo stared back at her from a 1987 newspaper scan. Blonde pigtails, gap-toothed smile, eyes bright with the innocence that someone had stolen forever. Sarah's stomach clenched as she read the details. 8 years old. Vanished while walking home from her friend's house on Maple Street, just 6 blocks from where Maggie had been found dying. A soft knock at the clinic's back door made Sarah jump. Through the frosted glass, she could make out Tom's familiar silhouette. She hesitated, then walked over and turned the deadbolt. "You've been avoiding my calls," Tom said, stepping inside. His usual easy smile was replaced by something harder, more guarded. "Reynolds is looking for you. Says it's urgent." "I've been busy," Sarah replied, closing the door but not quite meeting his eyes. "Research?" Tom's gaze drifted to her laptop screen, still displaying Emma Patterson's photo. His face went pale. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Following the evidence, she moved to stand between him and the computer. "That bone fragment I found in Maggie, it's human. A child's rib bone, to be specific. And given where Maggie was found, I think we both know whose bone it might be." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Tom's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "You can't know that for certain. Could be from anywhere, anyone. The dental work on the fragment suggests mid-1980s techniques. Emma Patterson disappeared in 1987. Sarah's voice remained steady, clinical, but her heart was racing. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He took a step back. "Sarah, you're scaring me." What's this about? Your father owned that property where Maggie was found. Your family's owned it for 40 years. She watched his face carefully. You would have been, what, 17 when Emma disappeared? Old enough to remember. Of course I remember. The whole town was turned upside down. Search parties, roadblocks, FBI agents crawling all over the place. Tom's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. What are you implying? Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was Dr. Peterson from the State Forensics Lab. She answered, keeping her eyes on Tom. Dr. Chen? I have preliminary results on that bone fragment you sent over. You were right. It's human, approximately 8 to 10 years old at time of death. But there's something else. Peterson's voice was grim. There are tool marks on the bone, clean cuts. Someone dismembered this child's body. The phone slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Tom was already moving toward the door. I should go, he said, his voice hollow. Reynolds will want to talk to everyone who knew about that property. Tom, wait. Sarah caught his arm. If you know something, anything about what happened to Emma, you need to tell me. Or tell Reynolds. This secret has been buried long enough. He turned back to her, and for a moment she saw something raw and desperate in his eyes. Some secrets are buried for good reasons, Sarah. Some truths destroy more than they heal, and some truths are the only way to bring justice to a murdered child. Tom pulled free from her grip. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Emma Patterson's disappearance, it wasn't random. There were people involved, important people. People who've spent 36 years making sure the truth stayed buried. Who, Tom? Who are you protecting? But he was already at the door, his hand on the handle. Be careful, Sarah. Maggie died because she dug up something that should have stayed buried. Don't make the same mistake. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of his words and the haunting image of Emma Patterson's school photo still glowing on her laptop screen. Outside, storm clouds gathered in the evening sky, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The truth about Emma Patterson was clawing its way to the surface, and someone in Millbrook was willing to kill to keep it buried. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Sarah pulled into a driveway, rain hammering against her windshield with violent intensity. She sat in her car for a moment, staring at the manila envelope on her passenger seat, the one containing photocopies of the original mine inspection reports that Marcus had risked his career to obtain. The documents that proved beyond doubt what she'd suspected since finding those bone fragments in Bella's collar. Lightning illuminated her house in stark, ghostly flashes, and for a moment she could swear she saw a figure standing on her porch. But when the next bolt struck, the porch was empty, just shadows and rain and her overworked imagination. Inside, she spread the documents across her kitchen table, cross-referencing dates and names with the research she'd compiled over the past week. The pattern was undeniable now. 12 men had entered the Hartwell mine on the morning of September 15, 1987. According to the official reports, all 12 had died in the collapse that afternoon. But according to Marcus's documents, the real inspection reports that someone had buried, only 11 bodies were ever recovered. The 12th man was Miguel Santos, a 26-year-old immigrant worker who'd been sending money back to his family in El Salvador. The man whose wedding ring Sarah now kept locked in her safe, the ring that had been embedded in Bella's collar along with fragments of human bone. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Stop digging or join him." Sarah's blood turned cold. She moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass, but saw nothing except the distorted glow of streetlights. Someone was watching her, someone who knew exactly what she'd discovered. The sound of her doorbell cut through the storm like a blade. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was nearly midnight. No one came calling at this hour with good intentions. The bell rang again, followed by urgent knocking. "Dr. Chen? Please, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." The voice was familiar. Young, female, desperate. Sarah recognized it as belonging to Elena Santos, the woman who'd been asking questions around town about her grandfather, Miguel's granddaughter. Sarah opened the door to find Elena soaked to the skin, her dark hair plastered against her skull, her eyes wild with fear and determination. "They killed him," Elena said without preamble, pushing past Sarah into the warmth of the house. "They killed my grandfather, and now they're going to kill me too. Elena, what are you talking about? Who's going to kill you?" "I found his journals, the ones he kept hidden in my grandmother's house all these years. She never told anyone, never said a word, but she saved everything." Elena pulled a plastic bag from inside her jacket, protecting its contents from the rain. "He didn't die in the mine collapse. He was murdered 3 days later." Sarah stared at the bag, seeing water-stained notebooks and yellowed photographs through the plastic. "How do you know?" "Because he wrote about it, about what he saw in the mine that day, about why they couldn't let him live." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "They weren't just mining coal, Dr. Chen. They were using the mine to dispose of things, bodies, evidence, things that needed to disappear forever." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Hartwell mine had been owned by the Blackwood family, the same family that had controlled the town's politics and police force for generations. The same family that currently included Mayor Blackwood and half the town council. "Your grandfather was a witness," Sarah said slowly. "He survived the collapse and saw something he shouldn't have." Elena nodded, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. "They hunted him for 3 days before they caught him, tortured him to find out who else he'd told. Then they killed him and threw his body back into the mine, made it look like he'd been trapped there all along. But how did his remains end up?" "In the dog's collar," Elena finished. "My grandfather was smart. Before they caught him, he buried evidence. Wedding ring, documentation, even bone fragments he'd collected from other victims in the mine. He left clues, hoping someday someone would find them and expose the truth." Sarah thought about Bella, the dying dog whose final act had been to reveal this decades-old secret. Had she somehow inherited the location from her ancestors? Had some deep canine instinct led her to that burial site? "There's more," Elena continued, her voice barely audible over the storm. "The mine wasn't just a disposal site. It was part of something bigger, a network that reached all the way to the state capitol. People who crossed the wrong politicians, witnesses who saw too much, investigators who got too close, they all ended up in that mine." Lightning flashed again, and this time Sarah was certain she saw movement in her yard. Someone was out there in the storm, watching, waiting. "Elena," she said quietly, "we need to get out of here. Now." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have in Dr. Sarah Chen's hands as she sat in her truck outside the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. 3 days had passed since she'd made her decision, 3 sleepless nights weighing the consequences of what she was about to do. The dying retriever's final moments had unlocked a chain of discoveries that led her here, to this moment where she held the power to shatter everything Millbrook thought it knew about itself. Sheriff Jim Reeves emerged from the building, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he spotted her truck. Sarah's stomach clenched. Jim had been her father's best friend, had taught her to fish on Lake Millbrook when she was 8 years old. Now she was about to hand him evidence that would destroy his predecessor's legacy and potentially implicate half the town's founding families. "Sarah, honey, what brings you by?" Jim approached her rolled-down window, his tone warm and familiar. "Everything okay at the clinic?" She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Actually, Jim, I need to talk to you. Officially. It's about something I found." His expression shifted, the friendly familiarity replaced by professional alertness. "Come on inside, then." The sheriff's office smelled of coffee and old paperwork, unchanged since her childhood visits with her father. Jim settled behind his desk, gesturing for her to take the chair across from him. Sarah placed the envelope on the scarred wooden surface between them, but kept her hand on it. "Before I show you this, I need you to understand something," she began. "Once you see what's in here, there's no going back. This is going to hurt people, good people who had nothing to do with what happened. Jim leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped. "Sarah, whatever it is, we'll handle it the right way. That's what we do here." As Jim opened the envelope and began examining the contents, Sarah watched his face transform. The dental records Marcus Walsh had helped her obtain, the photographs she'd taken of the remains, the jewelry that had been buried with the body, and finally, the most damning piece of evidence, a handwritten note she'd found tucked inside the locket, so deteriorated it had taken a specialist 3 days to make it legible. "Dear God," Jim whispered, holding up the enhanced image of the note. "Is this what I think it is?" "A confession," Sarah confirmed, "written by Rebecca Hartley before she died. She names 3 men, Jim, 3 men who are still considered pillars of this community." Jim set down the papers with shaking hands. "Thomas Brennan, Carl Morrison, and—" He looked up at her, his face pale. "Jesus, Sarah. This implicates Senator Morrison's father and Judge Brennan's grandfather. These families built half this town." "I know." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Believe me, I know what this means." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. Through the window, Sarah could see Main Street bustling with afternoon activity. Mrs. Henderson walking her poodle past Morrison's hardware store. A group of teenagers sharing milkshakes outside Brennan's diner. Normal life continuing, unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. "The note says she was pregnant," Jim continued reading. "Says they—" "God almighty, Sarah. They killed her to cover up what happened." The coroner in the next county confirmed it. Blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the timeline. She was 17, Jim. 17 years old, and they murdered her because she was going to expose them. "And Rebecca Hartley has been lying in an unmarked grave for 43 years, while everyone assumed she ran away," Sarah replied, standing as well. "Her family died never knowing what happened to her. Don't they deserve justice too?" "There's more," she added quietly. "I think there were others. Rebecca's note mentions the other girls who couldn't fight back. This wasn't an isolated incident, Jim. This was a pattern." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "How long have you known about this?" "A week, maybe less. I've been trying to figure out if there was another way, but—" She gestured helplessly at the evidence spread across his desk. "Some secrets are too big to keep buried." Jim nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing in his weathered features. "Then I guess we'd better start digging." The morning mist clung to the cemetery gates, like guilty secrets refusing to let go. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed through the wrought-iron entrance, the manila envelope tucked beneath her jacket feeling heavier than the weight of every life she'd saved in her clinic. Behind her, Marcus kept pace, his footsteps echoing her own uncertainty. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, though no one else stirred in the pre-dawn silence. Sarah nodded toward the weathered headstone they'd located yesterday. "Eleanor Whitmore deserves to have her story told, even if it's 30 years too late." The grave sat beneath an ancient oak, its roots probably intertwined with whatever remained of the woman who'd tried to expose the truth all those decades ago. Sarah knelt and placed the envelope containing copies of all the evidence against the headstone. Inside were photographs of the documents Old Blue had led her to, copies of financial records, and a detailed letter explaining everything she'd uncovered about the Riverside Development Project conspiracy. "The question is whether we're brave enough to follow through," Sarah said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. Marcus checked his watch. "The newspaper editor will be in his office in 2 hours. Once we hand this over, there's no taking it back." They walked back toward town in contemplative silence, both knowing that their next decision would irrevocably alter Millbrook's future. The quaint shops lining Main Street looked different now, almost fragile, as if the truth might shatter the very foundations of the community Sarah had called home her entire life. At the clinic, Sarah found herself moving through her morning routine mechanically, each familiar task, checking on overnight patients, preparing medications, reviewing appointment schedules, felt like she was saying goodbye to a life that might not exist after today. The animals sensed her distress. Cats purred more insistently, Dogs pressed closer during examinations, as if offering comfort for a pain they couldn't understand. Around 10 o'clock, the bell above her door chimed with unusual urgency. Thomas Crane strode in, his face flushed, and his usual politician's composure cracked around the edges. "Dr. Chen, we need to talk." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course. What can I help you with?" "I think you know exactly what this is about." Thomas glanced around the empty waiting room, then stepped closer to the reception desk. "Word travels fast in a small town. People have noticed you asking questions about things that are better left alone." "I'm not sure what you mean." Thomas leaned forward, his hands flat on the counter. "The Whitmore property, the old development plans. Ring any bells?" His eyes narrowed. "You've been poking around in archives, talking to people who were around 30 years ago. That kind of curiosity can be dangerous in a place like this." Sarah felt ice crystallize in her veins, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Are you threatening me, Thomas?" "I'm trying to protect you." His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "You have no idea what you're walking into." Eleanor Whitmore thought she was doing the right thing too, and look what happened to her. What exactly did happen to her? Thomas straightened, his face shuttering closed. She died. Tragic accident. But accidents have a way of repeating themselves when people don't learn from history. The clinic door chimed again, and Marcus walked in, immediately reading the tension in the room. Thomas acknowledged him with a curt nod before turning back to Sarah. "Think very carefully about your next moves, Dr. Chen. This town has been good to you. Your clinic, your reputation, your life here, all of it could disappear faster than you might imagine." He straightened his jacket and moved toward the door. "Some secrets are buried for good reason. Sometimes digging them up does more harm than leaving them alone." After Thomas left, Sarah and Marcus stood in stunned silence. The mayor's visit had confirmed their worst suspicions, while simultaneously raising the stakes to a terrifying level. "He basically just confessed that Eleanor Whitmore's death wasn't accidental," Marcus said finally. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "And he's warning us that the same thing could happen to us if we don't back down." They looked at each other, both understanding that they'd reached the point of no return. The envelope of evidence sat in Sarah's desk drawer, waiting for their decision. They could destroy it, continue their lives as if none of this had ever happened, and let sleeping secrets stay buried. Or they could walk to the newspaper office and potentially sacrifice everything they'd built for the sake of truth and justice. Outside, Millbrook continued its peaceful morning routine, oblivious to the storm brewing in the small veterinary clinic, where a woman stood weighing the cost of courage against the price of silence. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Sarah's feet as she climbed toward the heavy oak doors, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn silence. The manila envelope containing the evidence felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the power to unravel 40 years of carefully constructed lies. She paused at the entrance, her hand trembling on the brass handle. Through the glass she could see the empty hallway stretching toward Judge Morrison's chambers. In 3 hours the town would gather for what they believed was a routine hearing about the development project. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete dismantling of everything they thought they knew about their community. Second thoughts? Sarah spun around to find Detective Mills emerging from the shadows beside the building. His weathered face looked haggard in the streetlight's glow, and she realized he probably hadn't slept either. "How long have you been waiting here?" she asked. "About an hour. Figured you might need some moral support." He gestured toward the envelope. "That everything?" Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Inside were the dental records confirming the identity of the remains, the documentation of the cover-up, and most damning of all, the recorded confession she'd managed to obtain from Thomas Blackwood's son just hours earlier. The man had finally cracked under the weight of a secret he'd carried since he was 12 years old, watching his father and Mayor Crawford bury what they claimed was just a vagrant who died of natural causes. The boy saw everything, she whispered. "The beating, the burial, the lies they told afterward. He's lived with it his entire life." Mills took off his hat and ran his fingers through his grey hair. 40 years is a long time to carry that kind of poison. Is it wrong that I feel sorry for him? He was just a child. Feeling sorry for him doesn't make what happened any less real, Mills said gently. Those bones didn't bury themselves. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Through the morning mist, Sarah could make out several figures walking toward the courthouse. Even from a distance, she recognized Mayor Crawford's distinctive gait, accompanied by what looked like his entire family. Behind them came the Blackwood descendants, 3 generations united in their shared secret. "They have no idea what's coming," Sarah murmured. "Maybe some of them do," Mills replied. "Guilt has a way of preparing people for Judgment Day." As the group drew closer, Sarah caught sight of young Emma Crawford, the mayor's granddaughter, walking hand in hand with her mother. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with bright eyes and pigtails that bounced as she skipped along beside the adults. In a few hours, she would learn that her family name was synonymous with murder and corruption. "All these innocent people," Sarah said, her resolve wavering. "The children, the spouses who never knew. We're not just exposing the guilty ones." Mills placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "And what about the innocent man whose bones have been rotting in that unmarked grave for 4 decades? What about his family who never knew what happened to him? Don't they deserve justice too?" Sarah closed her eyes and felt again the weight of that dying dog in her arms. The way Max had led her so deliberately to that specific spot in the woods. It seemed impossible that such a simple moment could have triggered such massive consequences, but perhaps that's how truth always emerged, not in grand revelations, but in quiet, persistent acts of uncovering. The courthouse doors opened from the inside, and a security guard appeared. "Dr. Chen? Judge Morrison is ready to see you." This was it. The point of no return. Sarah looked back at the approaching families one last time. Mayor Crawford had stopped walking and was staring directly at her, his face pale but resigned. Somehow he knew. Perhaps he'd been expecting this moment for 40 years, living each day wondering when the past would finally catch up with him. "Dr. Chen?" the guard prompted. She turned toward the courthouse entrance, then paused. "Detective Mills? Will you come with me?" "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, falling into step beside her. As they walked through the echoing hallway toward the judge's chambers, Sarah found herself thinking not about the people whose lives she was about to destroy, but about the unknown victim whose story would finally be told. Somewhere, perhaps, there was still family wondering what had happened to their son, their brother, their father. After 40 years of silence, they would finally have answers. The manila envelope crinkled softly as she shifted it to her other hand, and somewhere in that small sound was the rustle of justice finally stirring to life. Whatever happened next, the truth would no longer be buried in the woods outside town, hidden beneath decades of lies and the bones of the innocent. The police station felt smaller than usual as Sarah sat across from Detective Martinez, the evidence bag containing the yellowed photographs spread between them, like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky a pale grey, matching the exhaustion etched on both their faces. "You understand what this means," Martinez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If these photos are authentic, if your theory about the construction timeline is correct." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. Half the town council was involved, including Mayor Hendrick's father. She picked up one of the photographs, studying the faces of men she'd grown up respecting, men whose sons and daughters still ran Millbrook. "The question is, how many people knew?" Martinez rubbed his temples. "We'll need to bring in a forensics team from the state. This becomes a federal case once we confirm those are human remains under the community center." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Sarah, once we make this official, there's no going back. This town will never be the same." The weight of that truth settled over her like a shroud. She thought of Mrs. Chen at the grocery store, always asking about her latest animal rescues. Of Tom Bradley, who taught her daughter to ride a bike in front of that very community center, of the countless memories, celebrations, and milestones that had taken place over what might be someone's grave. "What about protection for the families?" she asked. "If there are people still alive who were involved, they might try to silence anyone who knows." "Already thought of that." Martinez pulled out his phone. "I'm calling in state protection for you and your family, and we'll need to secure the veterinary clinic. If someone was desperate enough to break in once, they'll try again." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Her blood ran cold as she read it. Some secret should stay buried. For everyone's sake. She showed Martinez the screen. His jaw tightened as he immediately began tracing the number. "Probably a burner phone, but we'll check." He looked up at her sharply. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. Who else knows about what you found? Who have you told?" "Just you and Rebecca. My sister knows I found something, but not the details." Sarah's mind raced. "But the break-in at the clinic, whoever did that might have seen everything. The photos, my research notes." Martinez was already on his radio, calling for additional patrol units around the clinic and Sarah's home. As he coordinated the response, Sarah found herself staring at the photograph again. In the background, barely visible, was a young boy watching the men work. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, but something about his posture suggested he understood the gravity of what he was witnessing. "Detective," she said suddenly, "this boy in the photo, if he's still alive, he would be in his 70s now. He might be our only living witness." Martinez leaned over to look. "Can you make out any distinguishing features?" Sarah squinted at the faded image. "There, on his arm, looks like a birthmark, or maybe a scar." She felt a chill run down her spine. "I've seen that mark before." "Where?" "Mr. Garrison, Harold Garrison. He runs the hardware store. He's got a distinctive scar on his left forearm from an old accident. Always wears long sleeves, but I've seen it during his dog's medical exams." The implications hit them both simultaneously. Harold Garrison, who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life, who would have been the right age, who would have grown up knowing the truth about what lay beneath the town's most beloved gathering place. "We need to bring him in," Martinez said, reaching for his jacket. "Wait." Sarah grabbed his arm. "If we spook him, he might run, or worse, he might warn others who were involved. We need to be smart about this." Martinez paused, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "What do you suggest?" "Let me talk to him first. It's not unusual for me to stop by the hardware store. I get supplies there all the time. If I can get him to open up, maybe he'll cooperate voluntarily." "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "It's the only way," Sarah insisted. "If Harold has been carrying this secret for decades, imagine the guilt, the fear he's been living with. Maybe he wants to tell someone. Maybe he's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Martinez studied her face, seeing the determination there. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "You'll be wired, and we'll have units positioned nearby. At the first sign of trouble, we move in." As they prepared to leave the station, Sarah felt the full weight of what lay ahead. In the next few hours, she would either help bring justice to victims who had waited decades for it, or she would tear apart the only community she'd ever known. The morning sun was rising over Millbrook, but Sarah wondered if this might be the last peaceful dawn the town would ever see. Inside the box lay the collar from the dying German shepherd that had started it all 3 weeks ago, along with the photographs she'd developed from the hidden camera, the documented medical records proving the dog-fighting Ring S existence, and most damning of all, the financial records linking Mayor Davidson, Police Chief Morrison, and half the town council to the underground operation that had thrived for decades beneath their quiet community's facade. Through the courthouse windows, she could see reporters already gathering. Word had leaked somehow, probably through Detective Martinez's contacts at the state level. The story was too big to contain now, too explosive to bury like so many secrets had been buried in Millbrook's soil. Her phone buzzed with another threatening message from an unknown number. They'd been coming steadily since yesterday, when she'd finally made the call to the State Attorney General's office. "Leave town while you still can," this one read. Some dogs need to stay buried. But Sarah thought of Rex, the dying shepherd whose final moments had revealed the horror hidden in those woods. His trusting eyes as he'd led her to that clearing, even in his pain. Animals didn't lie. They didn't cover up crimes or protect reputations. They simply showed you the truth and trusted you to do something about it. The courthouse doors opened and Detective Martinez emerged, his expression grim but determined. Behind him walked a woman in a sharp suit, Assistant Attorney General Patricia Hoffman, who'd driven down from the state capitol after Sarah's call. Martinez caught sight of Sarah's truck and walked over. "You ready for this?" he asked as she stepped out, clutching the shoebox. "Are we ever ready to watch our world crumble?" Sarah replied, then shook her head. "But yes, I'm ready." They walked together toward the courthouse, past the growing crowd of townspeople who'd gathered. Sarah recognized many faces, clients whose pets she'd treated, neighbors who'd waved to her on morning walks, fellow business owners who'd welcomed her to community events. Now their expressions ranged from confusion to anger to betrayal. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop spat at her feet as she passed. 30 years I've lived here in peace," the elderly woman hissed. 30 years, and you had to go and ruin it all." Mayor Davidson sat in the gallery, his face pale and drawn. When his image appeared clearly on the screen, shouting encouragement to a bloodied pit bull, his wife got up and walked out without looking back. Police Chief Morrison wasn't there at all. He'd been arrested at his home that morning, along with 3 town council members and a dozen other prominent citizens. The financial records show a betting and money laundering operation that generated over $2 million annually. Assistant Attorney General Hoffman announced to the packed courtroom. This wasn't some small-time underground activity. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had corrupted multiple levels of local government. As the proceedings continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the choice she'd faced 3 weeks ago when she'd first discovered the truth. The easy path would have been to report Rex's death as natural causes, to bury the evidence along with the dog, to let sleeping secrets lie. Half the town would still trust her. Her practice would remain stable. Her life would continue undisturbed. Instead, she'd chosen the harder path, the one that led to this courtroom, to the destruction of reputations and relationships, to the unraveling of a community's carefully constructed facade. But as she watched victims' families learning the truth about their missing pets, as she saw the relief in Detective Martinez's eyes at finally having justice for crimes he'd suspected but couldn't prove, she knew she'd made the right choice. When the proceedings concluded, Sarah walked back into the afternoon sunlight. The crowd had grown larger, but the mood had shifted. The anger was still there, but it was directed now at the right targets. Change was coming to Millbrook, painful and necessary change. She climbed into her truck and drove slowly through town, past the veterinary clinic where it all began, toward home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences, new responsibilities. But tonight, she would sleep with a clear conscience, knowing that sometimes the most innocent gesture, a dying dog's final embrace, really could uncover the darkest truths and set them free.